Hello everybody and welcome back to another week in review. This time of the division's 19th Tankovy Corps on the Allies side and Panzergrenadier Grob Deutschland on the Axis side. Sorry for the pronunciation if that was incorrect. Remember that if you'd like to see any specific divisions covered in this series or any specific content covered by this channel, leave it in the comments section below and I will either get to it in chronological order or route you to where it already exists. Lastly, before we hop in the description of this video, as well as the description of the last couple week in review videos, there will be a link to a Google Drive document that contains all of the current battle group codes, the week in review links to YouTube for each division, and so on, so you can get a better grasp of when I've done certain divisions, when I've done certain things, and get easy access to those battle group codes without having to hunt around. Without further ado though, let's hop right into my first iteration of 19th Tankovy Corps on the Allied side. Now, the recon tab of this division actually featured quite a few things that I'm in love with, and that is Resvedka. Resvedka are my favorite Allied recon unit, aside from Ranger Marauders, which are kind of a one-off. While this division also gets access to Resvedka T-34s and a few other units, I felt like just bringing in bazookas was our best bet, as the anti-tank tab is not only quite small, but quite limited in what it can bring in. So as many Resvedka as I could, and that was the plan. We move on to the infantry tab, where I've tried to make the most of the very tiny tab, bringing in Phase A Strelky DP, Phase A Tanko Desetniki in the M2A1 half-track, Phase B Strelky, 2 cards of those, and a Phase C card of the Automachiki. This is after the buff to submachine guns, so these Automachiki and Tanko Desetniki really did pay for themselves, but you know, I'm going to be honest, they weren't as good as I was expecting them to be, being that they had nearly a 33% boost in their attack speed. But that is neither here nor there. Moving on to the tank tab, and this is the real meat of this division. In Phase A, I bring in a card of T-34 85 1943s, bringing them in at 1-star veterancy. I also round out Phase A with an IS-2 1943, and this guy typically lived the entire game long, rendering the Phase C card almost completely worthless unless I bring them up to 1 star. In Phase B, I bring in a 1-star KV-85 card, 7 per card. It seemed like the best option, and the KV-85 is just a decent tank all around, especially since the change to ranges. In Phase B, I also bring in the IS-2 Komrodi. In Phase C, I bring in the T-34 85 1943s again at 1 star, 12 per card, and a no-star card of IS-2 1943s. This is a very robust tank tab, but it is also quite a pricey tank tab. Not a lot in the way of budget tanks, as it were, something like a 50 or 60 point tank, but that's remedied a little bit later. In the support tab, I lead off with a card of Automachiki coming in the WLA motorbike, a card of the 52P TAC 353 76.2mm infantry guns coming in the Jeep, a Phase A commander, a Phase B card of supplies, and a Phase B card of the OT-34s, which I was using mainly as budget tanks, not really for their flame capacity. I also bring in an SU-152 card in this phase just to sort of pin down AT guns such as PaK-40s and such not, just things that I couldn't otherwise deal with safely with, say, a T-34 or a KV-85, and still providing a lot of suppression towards infantry engagements. In the anti-tank tab, I lead us off with a card of the PTRS-41s and WLA motorbike, a Phase A card of the M42 45mm guns in the Jeeps, and a Phase A card of the ZIS-3s. The ZIS-3s recently underwent a price drop, so do not pay any mind to the price that's currently on this division here. This was made just prior to that change, so that will be reflected in any thoughts that I have on it. Lastly, in Phase B, I brought in a card of the SU-85 at 2-star veterancy. 4 per card seems like more than enough, and when I'm bringing in an SU-85, I really need it to hit. I'm typically using these to deal with Tigers or Panthers, and I don't need to mess around with them being at a lower veterancy and perhaps getting more of them versus me using them to their fullest each time they're alive. In the anti-air tab, and this is an incredibly solid anti-air tab at that. In Phase A, I bring in a card of the Zenart 37s in the Dushka transport, as well as a Phase A card of the Zenart 85s. In Phase B, I do the exact same thing, just more per card, obviously. This is more than enough for an AA tab, honestly. I might even think about dropping the Phase B card of Zen 37s, but, you know, they were securing those plane kills rather than just scaring them off, and the 85s were being used mainly as anti-tank guns given the other pieces of this division, as it were. In the artillery tab, I lead us off with a Phase A card of the 203mm, which I ended up falling in love with. I put it in this division right off the bat, and at the time I was talking to my brother and said, I don't think I'm going to really like this thing, but you know what? I ended up really enjoying using this machine. I bring in a Phase B card of the artillery commanders and a Phase C card of the 152mm howitzers in the supply truck. In the air tab, I was feeling a bit, I don't know, strange, and I brought in 2 cards of ASF, one in Phase A and one in Phase B, both in the form of these Yak 3s, both at 1-star veterancy. Honestly, I didn't end up using these too much, and even when I did, they weren't very impressive. In Phase B, I brought in a B25J TAC 30 Mitchell, and in Phase C, another card of the same thing. These things were absolutely phenomenal. They more often than not flew through enemy AA to drop their munitions, and their munitions were fantastic, so 10 out of 10, these guys did everything that I needed them to do and more. Moving on to my division at the end of the week, and not much has changed at all. The only change comes in the air tab, where I've dropped the Phase B card of Yak 3s in favor of a Phase A card of the Yak 1B fighter bomber. Throughout the week, there were a few other changes that I made to this deck. Sometimes I was dropping the Phase B card of Zen 37s, as I had said, for a Phase C card of Mitchells, just to sort of further make my air power robust, but that seemed a little superfluous given how much air power I already had. Past that, I was also playing around with dropping the veterancy on a few things, adding veterancy to a few things, but this ended up being the way it had to be. I found that when I dropped the veterancy on the IS-2s in this division specifically, back up to a 1-star veterancy, I had a lot less map control in, say, a 4v4 situation on Tannenberg, where I was expected to cover a large swath of front, and perhaps an ally was struggling and needed help there too. You'll also note that with this division, I did go for the V for Victory deployment type. This was mainly because I was seeing a huge uptick in people playing Vanguard divisions, and really wanted to combat that without losing my late game prowess if the game went on for a lot longer. If I was playing as Vanguard, oftentimes I ended up in a situation where late game I was just completely pointless, watching the enemy steam over me, so V for Victory seemed like the way to combat that. Not many people play Maverick to this day, but I imagine Maverick would be a fairly good counter to this, if nothing else. Honestly, this division feels very well balanced. The IS-2 1943 is almost overkill for what else this division has to offer in its armored capacity. The KV-85 and T-34-85 are both excellent in the roles that I bring them in for, and so oftentimes I end up skipping the IS-2 until I start seeing much heavier targets on the field, such as Tigers or Panther Gs. A huge part of this division is just using that 203mm howitzer just to constantly shell things. God forbid the enemy ever counter batteries you, but honestly this thing was firing so far out of range of like a radio of some sort that it oftentimes didn't happen, so I wouldn't worry too heavily about that, but keep it moving if you are worried about it. However, this thing is incredibly slow and can't be linked up with a supply truck, so you're in a lot of trouble if it does get counter-batteried. The infantry tab was also kind of lackluster in this division, not for quality of unit, but for quantity of unit. You only have the 2 cards of Strelky and the 1 card of Strelky DP, all of them relegated to very specific phases, and so you're really rushed to use these Automachiki in Phase C, which are not the greatest in versatility. Sure, they're amazing at moving their way through forests, but they will do absolutely nothing for you in most mid-range or long-ranged engagements without heavy smoke presence or something of the like. The next weakest part of this division is likely the anti-tank tab, again not for quality but for quantity. All of these units are absolutely fine in the roles they perform, however you don't get very many of them. 9 anti-tank guns is what I was able to bring in, as well as the 4 Su-85s, so use them very carefully, or as I did, use the Zenart 85s in the anti-air tab to sort of buff this up. The support tab in this division was actually really magical. The only thing that I found myself wanting for was, say, an SG-43 or an MG-34, however it does get access to the Maxims if you're into that sort of thing. I simply can't justify their existence, so I stayed away from them, but more power to you if you like to use those units. All in all, I think that this deck is just very, very robust. I played this anywhere from a 2v2 up to a 4v4, and honestly, I didn't find an area where it was weak to anything. It wasn't necessarily weak at covering large swaths of fronts, nor was it inherently weak at covering small individual fronts. So honestly, I think that this division has very little in the way of exploitable downsides from the other team. However, obviously it does have its downsides. Most notably, if you're not incredibly careful, an infantry sort of blob on the opposing team could very easily unseat this. The IS-2 is many things, but fire quickly it cannot, and the Su-152, while excellent at dealing with infantry, can only be in so many places at once and is incredibly inaccurate. So be very careful against things like 50-second Sishrunk, such as I reviewed last week, Korp even, or even Tartalek. Not necessarily that these divisions will beat you every time, just that's what I would be worried about if I was playing this division. Also, if you're a newer player coming to this game and your first experience toward this game, especially on the Allies side, is to play 19th, don't get taken in by the IS-2s. The IS-2s are an excellent machine, but they're not really the end-all be-all of this division. I find that they're a nice inclusion to this division, but honestly they're a bit superfluous in certain roles, especially in a 2v2 game where you're fighting for such a large front, comparatively to team games. Sure, the IS-2 is capable of boxing in an entire area, but that's about all it's good for. You can't really advance with it such that you can with the T-34-85s, and in a 1 kilometer engagement, I would put my money on 2 T-34-85s winning over the IS-2 winning in an engagement against, say, a Panzer-G. But again, that's neither here nor there, that's just playstyle of the individual vehicles and not really reviewing the division. I find this division to be absolutely excellent, and I would include it in sort of my top 10 on the Allied side, and probably my top 5 on the IS-2 flavored division. I again have absolutely no idea how this would perform in a 1v1 game, but it does have all of the makings of what I've seen in 1v1 divisions, so I would imagine it would do quite well. Not necessarily top tier, but certainly quite well. Moving on, we have my first iteration of Panzergrenadier Grob Deutschland. And this one was actually a really fun division to play also. There's the one interesting unit, the Pak 41 Gerlich, and otherwise it's a fairly standard Panther division, sort of Tigers, Panthers, you get the drill from the other divisions that already exist in the same vein, but it feels kind of just like a beefy 5th Panzer as it were. In the Recon tab, I begin with a card of the GD Spartrupp, coming in the SDKFZ 251/1 half-track, and in Phase B the same thing, both of them coming in at a 1-star forced veterancy, but I honestly didn't find this cut into my availability too much, and these guys were more than enough to spot things out, which is exactly what I needed them for. In Phase B, I also brought in the Aufklauer Panther D, and this was kind of superfluous, honestly. The Aufklauer Panther D is excellent as far as recon tanks go, but I had a lot of heavy and medium tanks that I didn't really need it also in this tab. In the Infantry tab, I lead us off with the Sturmgruppenführer. These were coming in the motorbikes, and 4 per card seemed like a really decent availability for a unit that is also a leader and has MP44s. This was just excellent all around. Also in Phase A, we have a card of the GD Sturmgruppe. These are your MP44 wielding nightmares. A card of the Panzergrenadier, just typical Panzergrenadier, though they do have GD in front of their name and a slightly new uniform. And lastly, a card of the GD Pioneer coming in the half-track. These are just typical Pioneer again, but they did come with the half-track, and at 35 points they were an excellent inclusion for Phase A. In Phase B, I lead us off with another card of the Sturmgruppe, and another card of the Sturmgruppe with the MG. These guys were just, again, the same thing as the previous ones, 5 points more expensive with a much better mid-ranged engagement. Lastly, in Phase C, I bring in the GD Panzergrenadier just to sort of round out this tab. This actually ended up with fewer infantry in it than 19th Tankovy, however I felt better about the infantry that I had here, mainly because they're MP44s mostly, and the Panzergrenadier are all excellent options, but I honestly felt more comfortable with this infantry tab, even though it had fewer units in it than I did with the other. Moving on to the tank tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Panzer IV-H, a Phase A card of the Tiger E, a Phase B card of the Stug 3G, a Phase B card of Tiger E Führers, a Phase B card of Panther A at no star veterancy, and a Phase C card of no star veterancy Tiger Ease. Again, this tank tab is very familiar and just very standard. Without the inclusion of the Stug 3, this may as well have been the same tank tab that you get access to in 5th Panzer. Moving on to the support tab, you have the GD Flammenwerfer coming in the BMW motorbike, as well as a Phase A card of the SDKFZ 251/9D infantry support gun carrier thing. These things are absolutely excellent at 30 points. Again, it's nothing inherently new, it is a slightly new unit, but it's effectively just an infantry gun on treads, and you know what? It's excellent for 30 points. Lastly, in Phase A, I bring in the Commander in the SDKFZ half-track. In Phase B, I lead us off with the SMG-42s, as well as the supply trucks. In the anti-tank tab, I lead us off with the GD Panzerschrecks. These guys just came in the motorbikes. Panzerschrecks, there's really nothing to say there. In Phases A and B, I also brought in Pak-40s, and in Phase B, I brought in the interesting Pak-41 Gerlich 75mm gun. This guy was really interesting because it's incredibly high penetration. However, it does only have the 1 kilometer range, so bear that in mind when you're using it. In the anti-air tab, I lead us off with a Phase A card of Flak 43 37mm, as well as a Phase A card of the Flak 41 88mm, and in Phase B, again the same thing. This is oddly reminiscent of 19th Tankovy. Practically the same AA tab, however the Flak 43 is a smidge better than the Zen 37 in my opinion. The artillery tab leads off with an SDKFZ half-track mortar carrier, a Phase B card of the artillery commanders, and a Phase C card of the 150mm howitzers. And lastly, in the air tab, I had the FW-190 FTAC-3 fighter bomber in Phase A, just a single plane, but it was plenty more than enough in certain scenarios. Moving on to my division at the end of the week, and we see right off the bat in the recon tab that I've dropped the superfluous Panthers, as, again, I didn't need more Panthers. This deck had plenty of those as it was. I've also changed the MG42s from Phase B to Phase A in the support tab because I just wasn't using them come Phase B, and I really needed them in Phase A, oddly enough. In the anti-tank tab, I traded out a Phase B card of Pak-40s for the Martyr 3M, which is just a Pak-40 on treads, slightly less tanky, obviously, slightly more visible. However, it gave me a little bit more versatility when using these units. In the anti-air tab, I traded out a Phase B card of the Flak 43s for the Mobilwagen, which again, just a Pak-43, or Flak 43, on treads instead of stationary. This helped me keep up with armored pushes or anything like that, and the Mobilwagen has always been one of my favorite units in the game. Lastly, I spent those points that I saved from the Recon Panther in the Recon tab on the Artillery tab to bring in the 100mm artillery gun. These were mainly to use as anti-tank guns on the front lines, however they also did have that radio stat, so if the front lines ever pushed, I would immediately swap to using these as howitzers instead. For about a game or two, I also experimented with bringing in another card of the FW-190 FTAC-3 fighter bombers in Phase B, but you know, this one was more than enough for both my fighting and bombing needs, and occasionally I would bring it in, immediately drop my bombs on the closest target it could, and then use it as a fighter, sometimes even just dropping them on random forests on my way in, just to increase the speed maneuverability of this unit. This was another division that I felt was very well balanced. The Recon tab was fine, there wasn't really anything special there, but the addition of MP44s in the Infantry tab took this from being just another typical Panther division to being something really nice to have. Also with the addition of the Stug 3s to sort of act as my backward line things while the Tigeries and Panzer IVs push forward felt absolutely brilliant. As cool of a unit as it is, especially because it's novel, the Pak-41 Gerlich is kind of, a trap. 75 points to spend on an AT gun that is very slow, very easily spotted, and only has the 1 kilometer range with APCR seems kind of odd to me. This unit does perform really well at that 1 kilometer range and will just outright kill an IS-2 if it comes into contact with it, but you're more than likely just to be mortared out of existence after that, so you're kind of just trading 75 points for an IS-2. Granted, this is not always the case, and sometimes that is the trade that you needed to make, but you know what? I don't know that it's the best unit in this division. I think that at a 1 kilometer engagement, the Pak-40 is just as likely to secure a kill on an IS-2 and doesn't cost but 15 points less, with much more availability and a much faster weapon. That said, I did use this to great effect throughout the week, so I can't complain too much about it. Honestly, like I said before though, this division does feel very, very well balanced. Every time that I played it, I found that I had an answer to everything in every tab that I needed to have an answer to it, and for the most part, I really didn't run out of anything throughout an entire game. Infantry got a little sparse there for a second, and I wish I could bring in more Panzer IVs, but I feel like bringing them in Phase A is the correct answer. Honestly, and I know I say this practically every week, but the artillery tab felt more or less worthless to me. If I was pushing hard enough, then I really didn't need it, and oftentimes I was pushing hard enough, and I really didn't need it. Occasionally a game would go on for a while and I ended up bringing in the 150mm, but if the game had already gone on for that long, it was less about skill and more about who had more things to be shelled to death. As per usual, the Flak 41 88mm did an excellent job as acting as my mid-game AT support, as well as keeping the planes off of me should I need them to be off of me. The Mobilwagons keeping up right behind the Tigers and Panthers also made every push a breeze, and the MP44 wielding monsters that I had in my infantry tab were capable of clearing forests well ahead of the Tigers and Panthers and making sure there wasn't anything untoward in them. This is another division that I would probably rate in my top 10 as far as team games are concerned. It has an answer to just about everything, and I didn't feel out of place playing on 2v2s, 4v4s, or even a couple 10v10s that I did with this. This division just really has everything that I needed to have in order for me to enjoy playing it, as well as also have a lot of options available should you be fighting, say, an infantry division or an IS-2 division. Both of those are easily countered by this division, just given the units that it has access to. If I was to steer clear of anything, I would probably stay away from longer ranged engagements without your support weaponry. What I mean by this is Guardia at the full 750 meters are just going to easily pick off your Sturmgruppe if they do not have adequate MG42 or SDKFZ251/9D support. So be very, very aware when you're marching your Sturmgruppe through forests that they take proper pathing to not really expose themselves to that sort of far away fire. That said, once they do get to that 300 meters range, there's just about nothing that will stop them. I once watched a Sturmgruppe squad that the enemy didn't know was there completely obliterate 4 squads of Automachiki before they even made it into range to fire at the Sturmgruppe. So these guys are more than a match for most enemy Russian infantry. All in all though, that is going to do it for this week in review of 19th Tankovy Corps and Panzergrenadier Grob Deutschland. Remember that if you'd like to see any specific divisions covered in this series, leave them in the comments below, as well as if you'd like to see any specific content covered in this channel, leave them in the comments below. I've got a few other things in the works, and the Week in Review series will continue just sort of ad nauseum until I reach the end of the list or until somebody suggests I do something better. We're also coming up to the end of Week 2 in the League of Legends tournament, and so I might have more games to cast come the end of this weekend, so we'll see about that. Either way, I hope you guys have learned something.